Friends, we gather together this afternoon to celebrate the life and to honor the memory of Bob Zupnik. Bob's family is most grateful to all of you for being here with us this afternoon. As we all know, and everybody goes through the ups and the downs of life, and we all know how important it is to have people who care about us and who love us present at times like this, so we are grateful to you. I'm going to ask Cantor Gary Paller now to sing the 23rd Psalm, but I do want to make one comment about Cantor Paller, who spent a great deal of time with Bob Zupnik over the past many, many months. I know brought him joy and comfort, so it's altogether appropriate that Cantor Paller is participating in this service this afternoon.
Adonai roi lo echsar binot deshe yarbitzeni Adonai roi lo echsar binot deshe yarbitzeni al mei menuchot yenaleini Nafshi yeshovev, Yanecheini v'maglei tzedek, Yanecheini v'maglei tzedek, leman shemo. Gam ki elech begeitz al mavet lo ira ki latayim adi shivtecha umishantecha emayena chamuni Taruch lefanai Shulchan neged tzorai Dishanta v'Hashem roshi kosi revaya Ach tov v'chesed yirdefuni Kol yemei chayai, kol yemei chayai V'shavti beveit Adonai leorech yamim Adonai roi lo echsar Adonai roi lo
Adonai ma'adam v'teda'ehu ben enosh v'chashvehu. O Lord, what are we that you have regard for us? What are we that you are mindful of us? We are like a breath, our days are as a passing shadow. We come and we go like grass, which in the morning shoots up renewed, in the evening it fades and it withers. You cause us to turn to dust, saying, return, you mortal creatures. Would that we were wise, that we understood whither we are going. For when we die, we carry nothing away. Our glory does not accompany us. Mark the wholehearted and behold the upright. They shall have peace. The author of the first of the Bible's 150 Psalms describes for us in language that is both poignant and succinct the nature of the good life and the fruits of that life. Happy are those who have not followed the counsel of the wicked, or taken the path of sinners, or joined the company of the insolent. Rather, the teaching of God is their delight, and they study that teaching day and night. They are like a tree planted beside streams of water that yields its fruit in its season, whose foliage never fades, and whose fruit always flourishes. Let us now join together in the 23rd Psalm. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth my soul. He guideth me in straight paths for his name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. Thou hast anointed my head with oil, my cup runneth over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Kohelet, the author of the biblical book of Ecclesiastes, reminds us that for everything there is a season, a time for every experience under the heavens, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to uproot what is planted, a time to tear down and a time to build up, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to grieve and a time to dance, a time to throw stones and a time to gather stones, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to seek and a time to lose, a time to keep and a time to discard, a time to tear and a time to sow, a time to keep silence and a time to speak. Bob Zupnik died early this past Tuesday evening at the age of 101 and 4 months. We are grateful that Bob died peacefully, surrounded by love in the home of his daughter, Jill. Bob was born on November 19th, 1917. Now, just to put how long Bob lived in perspective, we note that Bob came into this world during the same month in which the Balfour Declaration, declaring Great Britain's early support of Zionism, was announced. And he was born almost a year before the end of World War I. He graduated from Shaker Heights High School and went on to study at Western Reserve University for a couple of years. Though he wanted to prepare for a career in music, the music director of his junior high school, Ralph Rush, had already turned Bob on to the oboe many years before. And though he was accepted at the prestigious Curtis Institute of Music, Bob's father pressured him to pursue a career in medicine. Bob reluctantly acceded to his father's wishes, but only as far as getting his degree in mechanotherapy, a field akin to chiropractic. You see, Bob was determined to pursue music. His father came to see this, finally gave in, but with one proviso, that Bob had to promise to take his mother to every single concert Saturday night during the period when Bob played for the Cleveland Orchestra. And this is what he did. Let's back up a bit and lay the foundations for his career in music. After a few years in college, Bob entered the military. Now, one time when Bob was at home from the service, he happened to meet Harry Fuchs, a Cleveland Orchestra cellist, who recommended to Bob that he meet then visiting conductor of the Cleveland Orchestra, George Zell. The year was 1941. Some years later after, I presume, many years of intense preparation behind him, Bob got word that Mr. Zell, and that's what Bob called him to the very day he died, that Mr. Zell, now the orchestra's new conductor, wanted Bob to be a member of the orchestra's oboe section. Bob joined the orchestra and played for 31 years before retiring in 1977. Now, when his first season with the orchestra was about to begin, Bob met a beautiful young woman, Helene Hirsch, at a Yom Kippur service at our temple down in University Circle. Here's how Bob described what happened next. I offered her a ride home in the family car, which she accepted. But the car was so full that there was no seat for Helene. And so she sat on my lap. As she got out of the car, I asked her out, and she said yes. And that was the beginning of a courtship, which led to a marriage of 65 and a half years, a union that ended only with Helene's death in 2012. Bob and Helene enjoyed a wonderful marriage. Each of them supported the other, and they did everything together. In addition, Helene attended, in the company of her mother-in-law, almost every Saturday night concert at Severance Hall. And I can still see in my mind's eye how Helene would look at Bob with a combination of appreciation, adoration, and a slight facial expression that signaled, "Oh no, not again," when Bob would tell one of his many favorite jokes for the umpteenth time. When I conducted the stone setting ceremony for Helene months after her funeral, I stood with Bob and members of his family at the graveside and recited prayers. When I finished, Bob, who was standing right next to me, turned and asked, "May I read a short eulogy for Helene?" And of course I said yes. At which point, Bob took a couple of papers out of his pocket, slowly unfolded them, waited for me to turn them right side up, and then began, and I quote, "God of Israel, thank you for the gift of life, the gifts of life and the length of days. Helene Paula Hirsch Zupnik was my greatest gift from you. God was not only our maker, God was our matchmaker. My hope is that God will bond our souls together as soulmates for eternity." End quote. And then he said, "To me, I would like to now offer a love song that I wrote for Helene, based on a well-known melody." Then, almost in a whisper, this 96-year-old man, still determined and regal in his own way, began to sing to the tune of Edelweiss from The Sound of Music. And he sang the following words, which he wrote. Helene, dear, you come out to greet me. I think I'll marry you. Then I'll have you forever. We together will bloom and grow forever. I love you, you love me. You are my sun-shining flower. End quote. And then he stopped. After the service, with tears in my eyes, I told Bob, I want a copy of that eulogy and that song, which I have kept all these years, attached to the eulogy for Helene that I myself had presented. Now, to those of us who knew and loved Bob, it was easy for us to recognize his many fine qualities. He was impish and funny, sensitive and compassionate, kind and honest. He was also persistent. His daughter Jill told me how hard he labored and then labored some more over the preparation of the reeds for his oboe. And while many years ago he completely lost sight in one eye and gradually lost much of the sight in his other eye, making him nearly blind, this did not stop him from living as boldly as he possibly could. When, for example, just last year, now in his 101st year, Bob attended a temple event for our seniors. And at that event, he asked if he, and it was only he, who ever made this request at any of our senior events, he asked if he, in the presence of almost 100 people, and while he was unable to see very much at all, if he could make a short speech, which he proceeded to do. And it really wasn't that short. Now, Bob Zupnik was a person whom I was blessed to know quite well. So when I began to give lectures many years ago on Jewish humor, it was natural for me to ask Bob to give me some of his favorite jokes, which he did. From that time on, and always with a wink in his eye, Bob regularly referred to himself as my mentor and to me as his student. And every time I used one of his jokes in a lecture, I was sure to make note of the fact that this joke came from my mentor, Bob Zupnik. And we all know how much Bob loved to repeat his favorite stories and one-liners over and over again. Indeed, long ago, we had all come to know the punchlines of these stories long before he got to them in the retelling. In the dark, we said to ourselves, as he began to ask the question, where was Moses when the lights went out? Or, at least you could now see it, we said to ourselves quietly, in anticipation of, in the beginning there was nothing. God said, let there be light. There was still nothing, but at least now you could see it. We knew them all, but we indulged him because we loved him so much and got a kick out of his glee. Now, when Bob began living in homes for the aged, at first with Helene and then by himself, I would visit them and then him from time to time. I always enjoyed those visits to see what he was up to, what he was thinking about, his memories, and how he was educating all the residents about the glories of Judaism. His talk would always turn to the great Cleveland Orchestra and what a privilege it had been for him to have been one of its members. George Zell, to Bob, was just a rung or two before the Almighty himself. And Zell, he would say, ruled his orchestra with complete and divine authority. And Bob had his favorite Zell stories. some of them involving recalcitrant musicians who did not fare very well in the contest of wills with the maestro. And his memory of Cleveland Orchestra history was prodigious. Just last spring, Bob rehearsed some of the particulars of the orchestra tours in which he had participated. His first overseas tour with Zell in 1957, the Robin Hood Dell concerts outside Philadelphia in June of 1958, Russia in 1965. When I visited him, he regularly regaled me with the main motifs of the music that he loved so well, conducting a phantom orchestra with his hands while he sang the opening motifs of Schumann's piano concerto and his Rhenish symphony, the third movement of Beethoven's Seventh Symphony, and the slow movement of the Dvorak cello concerto, which I believe was his all-time favorite piece of music. And sometimes when our conversation turned to scheduling my next visit, he would say matter-of-factly, "On your way over, why don't you pick up some lunch at Jack's Deli?" "Sure," I replied. "What do you want?" And Bob knew exactly what he wanted. Lox and cream cheese on a bagel sliced into quarters, creamed herring, and 8 pieces of rugelach, with the warning, no apricot and no chocolate. And of course, that is just what I did. And when I arrived and when he saw the food, his eyes became wide open with anticipation. And so we ate and we talked and we had a wonderful time. Bob doing most of the talking, of course, entertaining me with stories and one-liners and reminiscences, interrupted with periodic requests that we should do this again soon. "Sure," I would reply. "When?" he asked, without missing a beat. As his 101st birthday drew closer, I visited Bob once again. On this occasion, he was a little more nostalgic, a little more wistful than he had been the last time. He began to tell me what a marvelous life he had lived. His reminiscences peppered frequently with piquant aphorisms like, "I assume I'm near the end. I know I'm not near the beginning." At a certain point, he looked adoringly at the beautiful tree that loomed just outside the window of his room at Montefiore, and he said, "Every morning, God presents that tree to me." He was grateful for what he had had so long. Bob Zupnik is survived by his daughters, Marilyn and Jill, by his son-in-law, Lee, by his grandchildren, David and Becky and Dan, and by his great-granddaughter, Eleanor. He was predeceased by his wife, Helene, by his parents, Joel and Sadie, and by his sister, Nancy. Bob Zupnik, I'm sure you will all agree, was simply a remarkable person. For a person so slight of stature, his enormous will, his love of life, his capacity for friendship, his many joys which he loved to share, his outsized personality, made us forget that standing before us was a 100-year-old man who was telling him just how old he was. But his formidable spirit remained strong right to the end. Those of us who loved and admired Bob Zupnik will never forget him. Zichrono livracha. His memory will always be our blessing. Amen. I now want to read a piece that was sent by Helene's cousin in Indianapolis, Evie Moss. Dear Jill, Marilyn, and those gathered to mourn the passing of beloved Bob Zupnik, although unable to be there with you, I certainly am in thought and spirit. I remember so clearly how I traveled as a newlywed to meet my husband's, Bill Moss's, very special Cleveland family on Belcourt Road, Helene and Bob Zupnik. Both were so welcoming and endearing to me, this newest of family members. And such was the beginning of a long-standing loving relationship of almost 50 years. So many good times we shared in the Belcourt home in particular. As my family grew, each son was the beneficiary of Helene's needlepoint work. Bob readily entertained our little ones with his take on the sound of a buzzing helicopter. Home hospitality was the most tasteful, while always being the attentive host and hostess. Beautiful memories to this day and always. Daughters Marilyn and Jill, who had left the home nest, were referenced with much love and pride. And how special for Bob to experience daughter Marilyn pursuing a very similar musical career. During my visits, the two would oftentimes be engaged in long-distance telephone conversations with one another, relating to their musical world in common. Later years provided more opportunity for Cleveland visits that included Jill. Caring for parents was becoming a concern, was oftentimes the focus of long-distance conversations as well. In spite of working full-time, having downsized parents from the family home and the recent passing of Mother, Jill arranged a most festive celebration for Bob's 100th birthday. He and everyone else enjoyed every minute. For sure, no one had been more committed and nurturing than Jill in her parents' well-being and comfort these past 12 years and more. I would be remiss not to note that grandsons David and Dan's arrival meant that much more family for Helene and Bob to look after and to love. And how often is it that grandparents live to dance at their grandson's wedding, David's marriage to Becky, and also experience becoming great-grandparents. Both Bob and Helene were so much about family and the love they had for each and every one. In closing, I join with the many others who knew Bob in offering Steve's and my deepest sympathy on his passing. Although it may be of little consolation at this sad time, it should be of satisfaction to know that in Bob's passing, you can celebrate the end of a very long and a very productive life. You can proudly and confidently say that Bob's life was a life well lived, even though he was so visually challenged for more than 4 decades. I want to now call on Bob's daughter, Marilyn, who will reflect on the life, the qualities, the accomplishments of her father.
Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you for your beautiful words. Thank you, Cantor Peller, for beautiful singing. Thanks, everyone, for being here today. I think that many of you who have talked to my dad, as the rabbi said, he had some funny stories, entertaining stories, and, I guess one-liners you would call them, which I heard them. Didn't matter how many times I heard them. They were always funny. I heard them dozens and dozens of times. So I would just like to say that the first 100 years are the hardest. After that, it's all downhill. And do you know what 2 psychiatrists say when they meet each other on the street? You're fine, how am I? That was one of his favorites. And so I thought, being a musician, playing the same instrument as my father, I would talk a little bit about his life in music and his career and how he got started. You may have heard some of these stories or details of his life. He actually started as a violinist, and he told me he was 9 years old, which is actually a little late to start to play the violin, but he he started on the violin, and he was a rather serious violinist. And then when he was in junior high school, the orchestra conductor, Ralph Rush, he liked him very much. And one day he said, you know, I have an oboe here on the shelf, and we really need an oboe player. Would anybody be interested in learning how to play the oboe? And so my father said that he liked Mr. Rush, so he raised his hand, and he said, well, I'll ask at home, and which means he asked my grandmother. My grandfather wanted him to be a doctor. So he came back and he said, yes, I can play it. And Mr. Rush gave him the oboe in the case there, and my dad said thanks, and he started to walk away, and Mr. Rush said, no, wait a minute. He said, you can't play it, you have to have a reed. And, you know, he didn't know he was supposed to have an oboe to play. So then Mr. Rush got him a reed, and my father spent the rest of his career making oboe reeds. It's very time-consuming, and they don't always turn out. And so that's what he did. And he kept on playing both instruments for quite a while, and he had a string trio, violin, cello, and piano. And the players were Harold Fink, piano, who stayed in Cleveland as a pianist, Irving Klein, who was a well-known cellist, and Bob Zupnik, and they took the first two letters of each person's last name to make a name for themselves, F.I. Fink, Z.U. Zupnik, and K.L. Klein, and they called themselves the Fizucal Trio, or the Fizucalodians. Yeah, and I think they were pretty good. He told me that when they were in junior high school, they won a school competition at the high school level, so I'm sure they played pretty well. And so he played both instruments for a while, and then he finally gave up the violin and zeroed in on the oboe. Maybe there were more opportunities on the oboe. I don't know. I never asked him that. Usually schools don't have an oboe player, or orchestras don't have an oboe player. And so he was in Cleveland, from Cleveland, and when he was college age, he auditioned at Curtis, as the rabbi said, and he played for the famous oboist Marcel Tabuteau, principal oboe in the Philadelphia Orchestra, and teacher at Curtis, and he was accepted. But he did not. He told me he couldn't go against the wishes of my grandfather, so he turned down Curtis and stayed in. I think he studied for 5 years mechanotherapy, and he only used that knowledge. He did have a doctor's degree. He never was called a doctor. He didn't use it, but he used that medical training one summer when the Cleveland Orchestra didn't have a summer season yet in the early '50s. That was, and. When he was college age, he was here. He was playing the oboe, and he and two friends, Irving Klein, the cellist from his Fizucal Trio, and Alfred Zetzer, who he grew up with and became great bass clarinet player with the Cleveland Orchestra. They wanted to have an orchestra where they could play. There really wasn't anything for young musicians, sort of as a training orchestra, and the three of them got together and founded an orchestra, and that is the Cleveland Philharmonic. That was in 1938. Founded the orchestra, and then he was drafted in 1941. They were drafting before Pearl Harbor. He was drafted in October of 1941. Everybody, eligible had to go, and he was. You had to go down to the state capitol in Columbus, and somebody had read his resume and said he had medical training. So they were calling everybody's name, and they were assigned to basic training, different parts of the country, and he was the last one called, and he went down to. South, I think it was Fort Lee, and he was in several camps down there in his physical therapy unit. Eventually went to a band, changed to a band. He ended up at Carlisle Barracks and then West Point. While he was at Carlisle Barracks, he took the train down to Philadelphia, and that's in Pennsylvania. He took the train to Philadelphia, and he actually was able to take about 10 lessons with Marcel Tabuteau, that oboist he had auditioned for at Curtis. So at least he had a few lessons with him. And then when he came back from the service, he was going to get a union card in New York. You have to live 6 months, I think, was still in those days, to get a union card to play music and freelance in New York. And he was visiting his parents, and the rabbi said he bumped into Harry Fuchs on a walk one day, and he said, you should play for conductors and let them know you're around. That's how you got a job in those days. They didn't have the big national auditions like they do now for orchestra positions. But he said, we have a guest conductor this week. His name is George Sell. Why don't you see if you can play with him? And my father had studied with some couple of the oboe players in the Cleveland Orchestra, and he had played extra in the orchestra. They only had 3 oboe players in the section, 3 clarinets, 3 flutes, 3 bassoons, and so he would play extra when they needed a fourth. And played for George Zell, a few of the famous oboe excerpts, and then just shortly after, this is in the winter of 45, 46. Shortly after, he got a telegram. George Zell said he's been named the new music director, and would you like to join the Cleveland Orchestra as assistant principal oboe, which he did. And he loved that orchestra. He had only the greatest admiration for George Zell, as the rabbi mentioned. And just a couple of highlights, I think, from his time in the Cleveland Orchestra. He played assistant first, which means that there's another person that plays principal oboe and plays all the solos, and the assistant played first oboe sometimes, but a lot of times you just play in the tutti passages or when it's louder. But in the 1950s and the early 60s, there was an oboist, Mark Lifshey, who sometimes if he didn't feel well or it hurt his shoulder, he didn't show up, he didn't play, and my father did fill in for him. And one time was in 1958, in June, the Philadelphia Orchestra had gone on tour to Europe, and the Cleveland Orchestra was asked to fill in for them at a summer outdoor, I think, venue called Robin Hood Dell. And my father, Mark Lifshey, had shoulder surgery, and my father played principal oboe for that time, and he remembers that. The rabbi mentioned that he remembered the details about that, and he would tell me about that often. And one nice thing after that, George Zell went to Europe in the summers, and from Europe, my father received a letter from Zell, and he thanked him for his superb pinch hitting with the orchestra and for contributing to the growth of the Cleveland Orchestra. It was a very nice letter, and George Zell was, fearsome, he was a great musician, but it was very nice coming from him, and I have the letter, I framed it. And another time when they went on the tour to Europe and the former Soviet Union in the spring of 1965, Mark Lifshey had left the orchestra. He had a disagreement with George Zell in rehearsal in January of 1965. So my father did much of the first oboe playing. They hired someone else to help him out. And they went on this big tour for 10 and a half weeks. And that he played all the great pieces, Beethoven Eroica, the Schubert C Major Symphony in the music capitals of Europe. So that was a great experience for him. And Zell, sometimes when my father filled in for Mark Lifshey on short notice, Zell would give him a present. He gave him a necktie, gave him a box of chocolates. And on this particular tour, they had played in one of the music capitals, Vienna or wherever it was, and they were waiting for the train the next day. And Zell came by and he said to my dad, he said, "You showed them what an oboe should sound like last night." So I think, my father had these memories, and he loved that orchestra. And he told me a lot of his stories many times, but I was always glad to hear them. So, thank you. Thank you again. Thanks for being here.
Now I want to call on Bob's daughter, Jill, to reflect on her father.
Besides being known as a talented musician, those who knew my father will remember him for his jokes. He had so many of them, which he enjoyed reciting over and over. He also loved to share stories of his life experiences. He traveled all over the world with the Cleveland Orchestra and met various interesting people, so he had a lot to tell. Unfortunately, when you live to be 101, you end up outliving most of your friends and relatives. But my dad had an incredible knack for reaching out and making new friends, and he had so many. My dad was a wonderful husband and father, and how he loved his grandsons, David and Dan. When great-granddaughter Ellie came along, there was a new light in his life. As my dad grew older and needed more help, I always tried to be there for him. We were very close and never missed an opportunity to say we loved each other. On March 8th, my father fell and fractured his hip. He had surgery the next day, and then his health started to decline. My father went to a hospice facility for a few days, but when it was obvious that nothing more could be done, I brought him to my home to die. He passed away the same day, but the few hours we had alone together were peaceful and meaningful. I'm not sure he knew it, but I sang to him, kissed him, held his hand, and played music that he liked. I told him it was okay to go. Many times my father said that he was ready to leave this world so he could be again with my mother, who he loved and adored. He would say, wherever she is, somehow he would find her, so their souls could be together for eternity. Now I would just like to read a short poem that I think my father would have liked. At every turn of my life, I came across good friends, friends who stood by me, even when the time raced me by. Farewell, farewell, my friends. I smile and bid you goodbye. For shed no tears, for I need them not. All I need is your smile. If you feel sad, think of me, for that's what I would like. When you live in the hearts of those you love, you never really die.
O God of life, amid the ceaseless tides of change which sweep away the generations, your love remains to comfort us and to give us hope. Around us are life and death, decay and renewal, the flowing rhythm that all things obey. Our life is a dance to a song that we cannot hear. Its melody courses through us for a little while, then it seems to cease. Whence the melody and whither does it go? In darkness as in light, we turn to you, the source of life and the answer to all of life's mysteries. Will you please rise now for the El Mole Rachamim?
El Mole Rachamim, Shochen, Shochen Bamromim, Hametzei Menucha Nechona, Tachat Kanfei Hashchina, B'ma'alot Kedoshim U'Tohorim, Kezohar Harakia Mazhirim, Lenishmat Yakireinu, Shehalach Le'olamo, Anabal Harachamim, Hastirehu b'seter kenafecha le'olamim, Utzror bitzror, Achayim et nishmato, Adonai hu nachalato, ve'anu בשלום, בשלום, על משכבו ונאמר אמן.
Compassionate God, eternal Spirit of the universe, grant perfect rest in your sheltering presence to Robert Zupnik, our loved one who has entered eternity. O God of mercy, let him find refuge in the shadow of your wings, and let his soul be bound up in the bond of everlasting life. God is his inheritance. May he rest in peace, and let us say together, Amen. Will you please be seated? I want to announce that Bob's family will receive friends at the Temple Tifereth Israel at 26,000 Shaker Boulevard. For those of you who are not familiar with the location of the temple, it's just east of Richmond Road. You'll turn into the first driveway that you see after you pass Richmond Road, 26,000 Shaker Boulevard. They will receive friends after our interment service and until 4:30 this afternoon. Our service will continue now at graveside at the Mayfield Cemetery. Once again, on behalf of the family, we appreciate very much your presence here with us this afternoon. This concludes our service.